Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi. My name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime or creepy history topics each week. Last week we talked about Lacey Spears and how she cared more about MySpace than she did her own son. If you happen to like being viscerally enraged, I will make sure to have that video linked up here in the card for you. And if you just have an interest in true crime or the macabre in general and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Today we're going to be talking about teen angst gone wrong in the case of Rachelle Waterman. Just a heads up, there are some fairly graphic descriptions in this case. I'll make sure to put a timestamp on the screen right here, but I will also warn you throughout the story when they're approaching. But if you're looking to be overly cautious, maybe skip this one. Like I said, I will make sure to indicate on the screen where the rougher parts are, but I always want people to be aware of kind of what they're getting into. With that said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Rachelle Waterman was born on August 26, 1988 in Craig, Alaska, to her parents Carl and Lori Waterman. Carl, otherwise known as Doc, was a well-respected real estate agent as well as president of the school board, while Lori worked as a special education teacher's aide by day and in her spare time enjoyed doing volunteer work for her church. Throughout her early adolescence, Rachelle seemed like a pretty well-adjusted child. She played volleyball, she sang in the school choir, and she competed in academic decathlons. And what's more impressive is she did all of this while maintaining exceptional grades. But no matter how perfect things looked or seemed, if we're talking about it here, we know that it wasn't. From what I could tell, the divide in the family kind of started when Rochelle developed a particular interest that her parents were less than supportive of. She began researching and really diving into the world of witchcraft. I don't believe that she actually attempted to practice it at any point, but she immersed herself in it nonetheless. She began dressing in all black, painting her nails black, and adorning herself in spiky metal accessories. And her extremely religious parents were appalled at the changes they were beginning to see in their daughter. You know how it is to be a teen, you want to be edgy, you want to be cool, and your parents are just like totally lame about it. And eventually when they confronted Rochelle with these grievances, she did what any teenager growing up after Y2K would do. She took to the internet to publicly air her frustrations. And she did this via her blog, which was artfully titled My Crappy Life. She really seems to have used this blog as a public diary of sorts, crafting entries like, quote, "I am nothing. I am not who I was created to be. I have become who they wanted me to be. My crappy life. The inside look of an insane person. Location, Hell, Alaska. I just wanted to let everyone know I haven't been online because I'm grounded for getting an 89 on a math test. And I have computer restrictions because the parental units found my Wiccan books." Unquote. While I'm sure no parents want their family's dirty laundry or their private tiffs plastered all over the World Wide Web, Rochelle's blog really wasn't even the main issue at hand. The bigger problem was that Rochelle was not just venting her frustrations over the internet. She did not stop there. She also used her creativity to fabricate even more serious issues that she could complain to her friends about in real life. She told people that not only was her mother verbally and physically abusing her, but that she would torment her by calling her fat and withholding food from her. She even told some of her close friends that her mother had once pushed her down the stairs during an argument. But no matter what, the one sentiment that she always seemed to consistently carry through these rants was the fact that she, quote, hated her mother and that she, quote, wished she would die. Uh-oh. Luckily, despite how bad she'd attempt to make her home life seem, her friends never really believed that things were as bad as she said they were. They mostly just chalked her complaints up to normal teenage dramatics. And I hate to say luckily because I don't ever want someone to be ignored when they're reaching out for help. And sadly, that does happen all too often. People confide in their friends and family about what they're going through. They aren't taken seriously and what they're saying is brushed off, and then bam. Something bad happens that makes everyone wish they would have listened. But in this case, I don't think her friends were wrong. To clarify, I obviously have no idea what went down in the Waterman household. But there is no evidence outside of Rochelle's claims, at least that I'm aware of, that Lori ever abused her daughter. Doc also vehemently denies that there was ever any form of physical punishment doled out in their home. And Rochelle's godmother also denies that Lori would have ever hurt Rochelle in any way. Rather, that she had become incredibly concerned for her daughter given the path that she appeared to be heading down.
My dearest daughter, I'm sorry things between us are tense right now. Please don't feel like I think you're a bad person, because you're not. I know I worry too much about you, but that's what moms do when they love their daughters as much as I love you. I feel you pulling away from us. I will want us to be close, and you to be able to tell me things or just talk about nothing or anything. I wish you understood how much you're loved.
But despite all of this, for the most part, the arguments, the rebellion, and the angst all seemed to outsiders looking in like typical teenage behavior, nothing to be overly concerned about. That is, until Jason Arant came into the picture. Now, Jason was a 24-year-old man whom Rochelle started dating when she was the ripe old age of 15. Bleh. I don't know if anyone told him, but that's illegal, my guy. Like, that's a big old ick. And no one in Rochelle's life was more vocal about their disapproval of this relationship than Lori. Understandably so, she did not want Jason dating her daughter. So in an effort to protect their relationship, Rochelle and Jason began seeing each other in secret. Because that always ends well. But it worked for them, at least for a while. Rochelle would sneak out at night to spend time with Jason, and she would often spend weekends with him on his friend Brian's boat. And if they couldn't find time to sneak away and be together in person, they'd chat on the internet or they'd pass letters through a mutual friend. Before you're like, oh, young love. Nah, he's 24. These letters are kind of important though, so keep them up here. Throughout their relationship, Rochelle also confided in Jason the stories that she'd told her friends about her mother physically and verbally abusing her. At one point, she even told Jason that she thought her mother wanted to sell her, which, what? But Jason, blinded by the love he felt for this literal child, took every story that Rochelle told him as the truth, and he wanted desperately to be her knight in shining armor. So one day he flat out asked her what she wanted from him. What did she want him to do to help her out of this situation? Leading up to this conversation, he'd already spitballed a few ideas to her, like reporting Lori for her abuse, running away, getting emancipated, things like that. But Rochelle never seemed satisfied with any of these ideas. Instead, she floated the idea of a more permanent solution. Rather than going through the courts or running away, maybe it would be better if Jason eliminated her mother from the equation altogether. Yes, Rochelle asked Jason to kill her mother. To which Jason was like, yeah, okay. Rochelle gets to shoot down all of his ideas, but apparently he wasn't allotted any vetoes. Instead, he agreed and he got right down to planning exactly how he might do it. First order of business was to find himself a henchman. Murder can be quite the undertaking, so obviously it's best to involve as many people as possible, right? Lucky for him, he didn't have to look very far or hard for his accomplice. He was easily able to recruit his longtime bestie, Brian. You see, Brian Radell was absolutely freaking fatal for Jason, and Jason knew it. He knew he could always count on Brian to do absolutely anything for him. Their friendship was incredibly important to Brian. Actually, in Brian's eyes, they weren't even just friends. They were brothers. So when Jason approached him and asked him to participate in a literal murder, Brian was in. No hesitation. Later, he claimed he never believed they'd actually end up going through with it, but nonetheless, he agreed to help. Dude, am I the only person who's like a little bit thrown off by how easily the people in these stories always just seem to hop on board with plans to help kill someone? I used to think murder would be a harder sell, but I guess not. To be fair, much like Jason had, Brian did try to come up with other solutions before fully committing to the murder plan, but as a former victim of child abuse himself, he was extremely empathetic to what Jason told him Rochelle was going through. He felt as though it was his duty to help his brother protect Rochelle. Because remember, these are grown adult men, and Rochelle at this time is a 15, 16-year-old child. I know I keep hammering that point home, but it's important to me that nothing about these men's actions go down as chivalrous, okay? When Brian had exhausted all of his alternative ideas which were instantly shot down by Jason, Brian relented and he and Jason got down to planning the perfect murder. They talked through tons of different options, scenarios, and possible plans for how to actually carry out Lori's murder. But they kept coming to the same conclusion that their ideas were kind of far-fetched. They did actually try and fail one of their plans once when Lori was leaving work for the day. Brian waited outside Lori's school with plans to shoot her from a distance with a rifle. However, unbeknownst to him, the gun was missing a piece and it wouldn't fire, and Lori, unbeknownst to her, narrowly escaped death that day. After this failed attempt, the men decided that it would be easiest if Brian just snuck into the Waterman house when Lori was home alone and murdered her then. But a wrench was thrown into this plan as well when the day and time they chose ended up not working out because Lori had friends over that night. And while Brian was totally fine with murdering this one woman who he'd never met and had no personal issues with, he did refuse to endanger anyone else in the process. It's big of him. I don't know where this moral high horse was when he was perfectly fine discharging a rifle in the direction of a school, but I guess that's neither here nor there. So with 2 failed attempts on her mother's life, Rochelle was actually kind of starting to lose steam with the whole plan at this point. And she actually ended up telling Jason that she'd changed her mind and that she didn't even want them to go through with the murder anymore. She told him that things had started getting better at home and that she wanted him to just call the whole thing off. She even went as far as to tell Jason that she thought maybe the 2 of them should just cool it for a while, take a break from their relationship, and rekindle things when she turned 18 and had considerably more control over her life. But Jason did not want to hear that. He was afraid that if their relationship was put on pause, that the spark would die out, they'd never get back together, and he'd end up losing Rochelle. So instead of respecting Rochelle's wishes and calling off the murder of her mother, Jason instead told Brian that things at Rochelle's house were getting worse and that they needed to finish what they'd started sooner rather than later. He knew both Doc and Rochelle were scheduled to be out of town the weekend of November 13th, Doc for a business trip and Rochelle for a volleyball tournament. So he told Brian that that was it. That was their golden opportunity, and that time they were not going to blow it. If they wanted to rescue Rochelle, it had to be for real that time. They had to kill Lori Waterman. And on Saturday, November 13th, 2004, they set out to do just that. Lori spent that evening at a banquet before returning home around 9:30 p.m. Once they were sure she was home, Jason dropped Brian off at the Waterman house and drove away. Their plan was to get Lori drunk and stage a drunk driving accident. So Brian broke into the house through the basement and made his way towards the master bedroom. However, on his way through the house, he could have sworn that Lori had actually seen him creeping through the hall. But instead of hightailing it the fuck out of there and abandoning the whole plan, for an hour and a half, Brian just stood there, frozen in that exact spot, motionless, silent, and just waiting to be apprehended by police. Here's what I don't get. You haven't done anything yet. Bro, leave. You are literally still innocent. I mean, you might get slapped with like a little B&E, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that's easier to bounce back from than premeditated murder. But this thought must not have occurred to Brian because he just stood there. He waited and waited and waited until eventually he felt comfortable that police probably weren't coming. Instead, he now figured he was in the clear to carry out their plan. He crept the rest of the way down the hall. He snuck into Lori's room where he found her sleeping peacefully, and he woke her up by placing a rag over her head. He then restrained her and gave her clothes to change into. She was in pajamas, and again, they wanted to make it look like she'd wrecked her car while driving home from the banquet, so jammies didn't really fit that narrative. Once he'd forced her to get changed, he escorted her downstairs to the kitchen, where he ordered her to begin drinking from a bottle of wine. Once he felt she'd had enough to drink, he forced her into her minivan, and he drove the 2 of them to he and Jason's designated meeting spot. The 2 men then caravanned out to a second predetermined spot where the murder was actually supposed to take place. Now, as for that warning I gave at the beginning, that parts of this story get kind of rough, yeah, this is that. So proceed with caution. Or proceed to this timestamp right here. Once the men had Lori secluded out in the woods, Brian made multiple attempts to manually break her neck. However, no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't seem to manage it. So he and Jason then laid her out on the ground, where Brian proceeded to beat her with his hands and a flashlight. And when that still didn't work, Brian resorted to suffocation. He placed his hands over her mouth and nose and attempted to hold them there until she stopped breathing. However, both Brian and Jason would later claim that she survived this as well, that they moved her back into the van, and that she ultimately passed away as a result of her combined injuries. You guys, I watched a lot of footage from Rochelle's trial when I was researching this case, and hearing these men recount this in detail, point by point in their testimonies, it was outrageously difficult. They're both just so, matter of fact. Like they're talking about a movie and not an actual person. A person with a family and friends and a ton of life still ahead of her. It was sickening to watch. During this portion of the trial, Rochelle can actually be seen running out of the courtroom and gagging as if she's about to be sick.
Judge, can we take a break? Can we take a break, please? I'm sorry, we need to take a break.
We'll go ahead and take a break, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Listening to what actually happened to her mother proved to be more than she could stomach as well, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So once Brian and Jason were sure that Lori had actually passed away, they realized that they probably needed to reevaluate their plan. They knew that there was no way that her injuries would ever be looked at as consistent with a drunk driving accident. So after wrecking the van, Brian and Jason decided that their best bet was to douse it in gasoline and light it on fire. And that's exactly what they did. They lit the van on fire with Lori inside and just left. Headed home and tucked right on in for a good night's sleep. Lori's charred van was discovered the next day, and although her remains were found inside, she was not immediately identifiable. But people very quickly realized she was missing, and it didn't take long for word to spread that a minivan similar to hers had been found charred in the woods with human remains inside. This obviously led those closest to her to immediately fear the worst. Doc and Rochelle both rushed home from their respective trips, hopeful that the whole situation was just a big misunderstanding. And while he never gave up hope that Lori would be found safe and well, Doc couldn't ignore a sinking feeling he had in his gut that his wife was gone. And sadly, a few days later, the VIN number for the van came back and confirmed that it was, in fact, Lori's minivan. And even though the body had not technically been identified yet, police still prepared to deliver the devastating news to Doc and Rochelle. They expected the conversation to be extremely difficult, so police actually contacted Rochelle's godparents and requested that they pick her up from school and bring her home so that she and Doc could be together when they heard the news. Doc was stoic as he received the devastating news, but Rochelle's godfather has gone on record stating that, stoic or not, he was very clearly hurting. The homicide investigation began almost immediately after the positive identification on Lori's remains came back. They began the same way that most investigations begin. They interviewed anyone and everyone they could possibly find that was connected to Lori Waterman in any way. A list that did in fact include Jason Arant. They questioned Jason multiple times, actually, and eventually he did start to crack. But he didn't crack in the form of a confession, necessarily. Instead, he sold out his best friend, Brian. You know, Brian, the guy who would do anything for Jason and considered him a brother? Yep, Jason sold him right down the river. He told police that Brian had murdered Lori, and he just casually left out the part where he was equally culpable. He also made no mention of the fact that Rochelle was ever involved in this whole mess either. And this might be like a hot take, I don't know, but I don't really even consider her involved anymore. I think she was a teenage girl going through an incredibly difficult period of her life. She was feeling out of place and misunderstood, and I think she said and did some really dumb stuff. I think she exaggerated her circumstances to garner sympathy, but I think she genuinely meant it when she asked Jason to call the whole thing off. I think by the time it actually took place, Lori's murder was completely selfish on Jason's part. That he did it to prevent Rochelle from taking a break from their relationship and coming to her senses and leaving him altogether. In my opinion, he figured he could get Brian to do the bulk of things. Rochelle would default to needing him, and if shit hit the fan, he could use Brian as a scapegoat. Starting to seem like that brotherhood was a little bit one-sided. Now, because Jason had blamed basically everything on Brian, police requested that Jason set up a meeting with Brian, to which he would wear a wire and hopefully capture a confession on tape. The conversation really seemed to go in Jason's favor. Brian gave a detailed confession, downplaying Jason's involvement, making the whole night sound like a one-man operation. And Jason felt really good coming out of the conversation. He figured he was in the clear. But thankfully, both men were ultimately arrested, and Jason would eventually give in and confess his full involvement. He eventually admitted that he had orchestrated the whole plan in an attempt to protect Rochelle from her mother. Jason also told police that despite their relationship and the fact that he was doing this for her, Rochelle had absolutely no idea that there was any plan in place against her mother's life at all. Again, I really don't know if at this point she even still knew this was going down or not, but I can tell you that police were unsure of her innocence. Although he thought he had tried to protect her and keep her out of harm's way, Jason made statements in some of his interviews that inadvertently ended up implicating Rochelle in the planning. Once police began formally looking into Rochelle, they requested and obtained search warrants to search Rochelle and Jason's homes and seize anything they thought might be necessary in building a case against them. During these searches, they took away computers, clothing, and you guessed it, friends, Rochelle and Jason's love letters. Letters, mind you, that were filled with very graphic, violent, and sexual fantasies. And when police finally felt they had enough evidence to justify an interview with Rochelle, she did ultimately admit to having some involvement in the initial plan to murder Lori. She explained to police that yes, while in an extremely emotional state, she had asked Jason to kill her mother, but that she'd later come to her senses and request that he call the whole thing off. And outside of a few incriminating conversations in Rochelle and Jason's letters, there really wasn't anything definitively or forensically linking Rochelle to her mother's death. But she was still arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At her trial, Rochelle's defense attorney accused the prosecution of leading Jason to implicate Rochelle in the first place, arguing that police had all but forced him to say that she was way more involved than she ever really was. They also claimed that investigators used high-pressure psychological interrogation tactics and intimidation to draw a false confession out of Rochelle, a 16-year-old child who was interviewed without a parent or a lawyer present and who claimed that she did not fully understand her Miranda rights. All in all, I have to say that Rochelle's defense did a wonderful job of discrediting Jason and his version of events. Her attorney was able to use Jason's own words against him, and he clearly illustrated the benefits that Jason had received by striking a deal with the prosecution and implicating Rochelle. Specifically the fact that prior to striking his deal, he was staring down the barrel of like 300 years or something crazy. But after his plea, he was only facing a minimum of 16. Not to mention, the deal had helped him skirt things like child porn charges from explicit photos that he had received from Rochelle when she was just 15. Obviously, none of this is funny in any way, but I do have to admit that I laughed a little when Rochelle's defense attorney made this, joke.
And this deal actually salvages your life, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
You get out at 42 and you have a reasonable chance to do something. When you're a 25-year-old high school janitor Marine Corps dropout, maybe you could make a change, right?
Yes.
At 42, you might even still be young enough that you could still pick up teenage girls, couldn't you?
Again, obviously the context is not funny, but making a point to use this opportunity to remind everyone that they weren't dealing with the most savory of human beings in Jason was, in my opinion, kind of a great play. He then spent a decent chunk of time highlighting, my God, what felt like every single lie, big or small, that Jason had ever told in his entire life. Obviously, his objective was to obliterate Jason's credibility to the jury and hopefully secure an innocent verdict for Rochelle. But following closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 7 days. They barely even took breaks for lunch before they came back deadlocked. No matter how hard they tried, they simply could not come to a unanimous decision regarding Rochelle's involvement, or lack thereof. Yep, ladies, gents, and non-binary friends, we have ourselves a mistrial. Rochelle was then retried in 2011, but rather than go for first-degree murder again, which, let's call a spade, getting her on first-degree murder was a pipe dream to begin with. And the prosecution knew it, so the second time around, they instead charged her with criminally negligent homicide. Jason refused to testify at Rochelle's second trial, however, Brian did take the stand and repeat his testimony. And following the conclusion of her second trial, Rachelle Waterman was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and sentenced to 3 years in prison. So yes, she's out now. She's 33, and she's just doing her thing. Jason Arant pled guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years with the possibility of parole after just 16. And Brian Radell also pled guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison with parole eligibility after 33. And, that's it. I guess the moral of the story, kids, is be careful what you tell people and what you ask them to do, because whether you're serious or not, they might do it. Let me know what you guys think of this case in the comments down below. Do you think that Rochelle knew Jason still planned to kill her mom, or do you think that she truly believed she'd called him off in the nick of time? I'm very curious to hear your opinions, so please sound off down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Before you head out, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. It's a small gesture, but it really does help out the channel a lot, so thanks in advance. And if you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out a new true crime or creepy history video each week, and I'd love to catch you back here in my next one. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.